In the first week of January 2011, a detective from Avon and Somerset Police boarded a flight to the Netherlands. She wasn't chasing a suspect. She was going to take a witness statement. A young couple who lived in Bristol had traveled home for the holidays, and the woman had contacted the murder inquiry to say that she and her partner might have something useful. Something about the building, something about their landlord. The detective, D.C. Karen Thomas, sat down with them and listened. The man did most of the talking. He was 32, Dutch, an engineer with a doctorate, articulate in his second language. He explained that on the night the young woman from the flat downstairs had vanished, he'd noticed their landlord's car parked one way in the driveway, and that by the following day it had been turned around. It's a small observation, the kind of thing a conscientious neighbor notices and feels slightly foolish reporting. By the end of that year, a jury would decide that the man giving that statement was the person who had killed Joanna Yates, and that the landlord he just pointed at had spent Christmas being dismantled in public by most of the national press. That's what makes this case worth returning to 15 years later. Not the crime itself, which was, in the end, tragically ordinary in its mechanics, but the story that grew around it. Because the story of Joanna Yates is a case study in something that has nothing to do with forensics and everything to do with how human beings decide who looks guilty. The woman at the center. She has a habit of disappearing from her own case. It's worth resisting. Joanna Yates was 25. She grew up in Ampfield, a village in Hampshire, studied landscape architecture, and took a postgraduate diploma at the University of Gloucestershire. She met Greg Reardon at a practice in Winchester in 2008. They moved in together, and when work brought them west, they came to Bristol. She'd taken a job at Building Design Partnership. In October 2010, they moved into a garden flat at 44 Canongee Road in Clifton, the handsome, hilly, Georgian part of the city, all pale terraces and steep pavements. Landscape architecture is a quiet profession. You design the parts of a place that people walk through without noticing, the way a path bends, where a tree gets planted, how a courtyard catches light in February. It is patient, unglamorous work about making public space feel humane. There is something bleak about the fact that she became famous for the opposite, for the way a public space turned on someone. Friday the 17th. It was the last working Friday before Christmas. Snow had already come to the West Country that December, unusually early and unusually hard. Joanna went for drinks with colleagues at the Bristol Ram on Park Street, then walked home alone at around 8, a 15-minute walk she'd done many times. CTV caught her on the way, a shop for cider, then a Tesco Express, where she bought a pizza. Greg had left that evening for Sheffield to see family. She would have the flat to herself. She never ate the pizza. That detail would later matter more than anyone could have guessed. 2 days later, Greg came home to an empty flat, and the wrongness of it announced itself immediately in small domestic details. Her coat was there, her phone was there, her keys were there, her boots were in the middle of the hall, which he told the court was unlike her. He rang her friends, he rang her family, then he rang the police. Consider what investigators face at that moment. A missing adult who has left behind every object a person uses to leave. There is no note, no argument, no debt, no ex-partner with a history. There is only absence and a set of objects that suggest she never made it out of her own front door. And it is Christmas week. Half the potential witnesses are traveling. Snow is falling on everything. Christmas morning. On the morning of the 25th, a couple called Daniel and Rebecca Birch had opened their presents early and taken the dog out along Longwood Lane in Fayland, a rural road about 3 miles from Clifton. Mr. Birch later described seeing what looked like a shape in the snow at the verge and a glimpse of denim. They walked on. Then he realized what he'd seen and turned back. Recovery took hours in freezing conditions. Officers eventually used a broom handle to help lift her clear of the compacted snow. Here, the case runs straight into a forensic problem that most true crime coverage skips, and it's genuinely important. Her body had been exposed to sub-zero temperatures for 8 days. Freezing changes tissue. It slows and distorts the biological clocks pathologists rely on. The post-mortem examination began on Boxing Day and took far longer than usual precisely because of that. And in the first hours, there was a working theory that she might have died of exposure because there was no immediately obvious injury. It was 28th December before the conclusion came. The cause of death was compression of the neck. So for 3 days after she was found and 11 days after she vanished, the investigation did not formally know it was a murder inquiry. Every hour of that delay was an hour in which forensic traces degraded, memories blurred, and the news cycle ran unchecked. Why the landlord? On December 30th, Avon and Somerset police arrested Christopher Jefferies. To understand why, you have to understand what an arrest actually is in England and Wales, because this is where public comprehension collapses and where the damage in this case began. Arrest is not accusation. It is a procedural tool. It gives officers a defined window to question someone under caution, take samples, and search premises. Detectives use it to eliminate people as often as to build a case. In an inquiry where the victim appears to have been attacked inside a locked building with no sign of forced entry, everyone with access to that building is going to be looked at hard, and the man who owned it and lived upstairs was always going to be looked at first. Jefferies had already given 2 witness statements voluntarily. He was 65, a retired English teacher from Clifton College, and he had, this is the uncomfortable part, a distinctive appearance and a precise, pedantic manner. He was released on police bail on the evening of January 1st. He was formally cleared in early March. He was never charged with anything. But between the 30th and the 1st, something happened that the British legal system had no real defense against. The 40 articles over roughly a week, national newspapers published a torrent of material about Christopher Jefferies. His lawyer later put the figure at more than 40 articles containing allegations the publishers eventually accepted were false. The pattern is worth examining closely because it wasn't random. The coverage reached for the same 3 levers again and again: his appearance, his personality, and unnamed sources claiming to remember something unsettling about him from decades earlier. Speculation about his private life. Speculation about a long unsolved local case. Former pupils quoted anonymously. Adjectives doing the work that evidence could not. None of it was evidence of anything. All of it was narratively coherent. And that's the crucial distinction. The stories weren't asking readers to weigh facts. They were offering a character and inviting readers to recognize a type. In July 2011, 2 things happened to those newspapers on the same day. In the morning, 8 national titles apologized to Jefferies in open court and paid substantial libel damages. In the afternoon, the High Court, the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Judge, sitting with 2 other judges, ruled that the Daily Mirror and the Sun had been in contempt of court. The Mirror's publisher was fined £50,000, the Sun's £18,000. The judgment described the Mirror's material as extreme and found that the publications had created substantial risks to the course of justice. Now, the legal mechanism here is genuinely educational, and almost nobody explains it properly. Under the Contempt of Court Act 1981, there is a strict liability rule. It applies to publications that create a substantial risk of serious prejudice or impediment to active proceedings. And it applies whether or not the publisher intended any harm. The Attorney General at the time, Dominic Grieve, made the point that mattered most. The act bites from the moment of arrest, not from charge, not from the start of a trial, from arrest. That is the line the industry had been treating as elastic for years. But the most interesting part of the ruling is the part that got the least coverage. Jefferies was never charged, so there was no trial to prejudice. The court instead accepted a novel argument, that the vilification of a man under arrest could impede justice by frightening off witnesses who might have supported his defense. Who wants to phone a newsroom's favorite monster and say, "Actually, I knew him and he was fine"? It's a subtle idea, and a genuinely humane one. Justice doesn't only require an unbiased jury. It requires an environment in which people are willing to speak up for the accused. The commentator Brian Cathcart, who had covered the wrongful conviction of Barry George for the murder of Jill Dando, argued at the time that the consequences could run further than fines, that more restrained crime reporting might mean fewer miscarriages of justice altogether. That parallel is exact. George, too, was an oddity in a neighborhood. He, too, was convicted in print before he was convicted in court. He spent 7 years in prison before that conviction was quashed. The other pressure. While this was happening, the relationship between the police and the media was fraying in a second, less remembered way. In early January, ITV News broadcast a report that included a former murder squad detective questioning aspects of the investigation. Avon and Somerset police responded by barring ITN journalists from a press conference, calling the report unfair and irresponsible, and complained to Ofcom. The ban lasted about a day before the force reversed it, while warning it would do the same again. It's a small episode, and it cuts against the simple version of this story. Because the simple version is, press bad, police good. The reality is messier. The force was managing information tightly, releasing details in fragments. The fact that Joanna was found with a single sock, for example, only emerged well into the inquiry. Reporters, starved of substance, went looking for color. And separately, Jefferies would later allege at the Levison inquiry that his name and details of his statement had been leaked to journalists by someone inside the investigation. The Daily Mirror's editor told Levison that police had given off-the-record briefings. The chief constable, Colin Port, denied it. An internal inquiry reportedly led to 2 arrests. Nobody was charged. So the picture is not one villain. It's a system, an inquiry withholding information, a press pack commercially rewarded for filling the gap, a public appetite for a face to attach to a horror. And, at the center of it, a suggestion that had come from the killer himself, the helpful neighbor, which brings us back to that flat in the Netherlands. Detectives came away from Vincent Tabak's account with a problem. His version of his own movements didn't sit neatly with what they could establish elsewhere, and D.C. Thomas later told the court he had seemed overly interested in the forensic examination of Joanna's flat. That is a subtle observation, and it's the kind of thing that separates competent detective work from box ticking. Ordinary witnesses want to know if you've caught anyone. They ask about the family. They express horror in fairly predictable ways. What they generally don't do is probe the technical specifics of what forensic teams have recovered and from where. So they asked him for a routine elimination swab and fingerprints, the same request made of many men connected to the building and the inquiry. He gave it. It matched material recovered from Joanna's clothing. He was arrested on January 20th and charged on the 22nd. There's a piece of criminal psychology here that recurs across cases and deserves more attention than it gets. Offenders who insert themselves into an investigation, who volunteer statements, offer theories, point at other people, are not behaving irrationally. They're doing 3 things at once: gathering intelligence about how much police know, establishing a cooperative persona that is hard to square with guilt, and steering attention. It's a strategy that works far more often than people assume, precisely because our intuitions about guilt run the other way. We expect the guilty to hide. The lead detective, DCI Phil Jones, put it bluntly outside court after the verdict. He described Tabak as intelligent and manipulative, a man who had the composure to dispose of evidence and then construct a cover story. And the cover story had a target. At his trial, it emerged that Tabak had implicated Jefferies by contacting police with false information about him. The press then took that thread and ran with it for a week. What the trial was actually about, here's the thing most retellings get wrong. Vincent Tabak's trial, which opened at Bristol Crown Court on the 4th of October 2011 before Mr. Justice Field, was not about whether he caused Joanna Yates's death. In May, he had pleaded guilty to manslaughter. The Crown refused to accept that plea. So the jury of 6 men and 6 women faced one question, and it was a question of mind, not of act. When he did what he did he intend to kill her or to cause her really serious harm? If yes, murder. If no, if it was an unlawful act without that intent, manslaughter. This is the hardest thing a jury is ever asked to do. Intent leaves no trace. You cannot swab for it. The prosecution, led by Nigel Lickley, QC, built its case on duration and consequence. The pathologist, Dr. Russell Delaney, told the court that death was not instantaneous, that she would have had difficulty breathing, that he would have expected her to struggle, and that nothing suggested she had been incapacitated by any other means. She had suffered 43 separate injuries. Tabak was roughly a foot taller than her. The Crown's argument reduced to its core. This took time, and every second of it was a second in which he could have stopped. The defense, led by William Clegg QC, offered a different frame. Tabak had been invited in. He misread friendliness for interest, moved to kiss her. She screamed. He panicked. A few seconds of catastrophic misjudgment by a man who had never done anything like it before. Not planned, not wanted. Then there was the aftermath, which the prosecution used relentlessly. A text to his girlfriend saying he was bored. A trip to an Asda to buy crisps and beer. Days of parties and dinners, and the performance of a worried neighbor. While his internet activity filled up with searches about the investigation, the sentences for murder and manslaughter, and the police's own website. Under cross-examination, Lickley asked him the simplest question in the case. All you had to do was walk out of the flat. Tabak paused. Yes, I didn't. The jury deliberated for more than a dozen hours across several days. On October 28, 2011, they returned a verdict of guilty by a majority of 10-2. Hold on to that number. 2 jurors, having heard everything, were not sure. That is not a footnote. It's a measure of how genuinely difficult the intent question was. The system is designed to tolerate that difficulty, and it did. Mr. Justice Field imposed a life sentence with a minimum term of 20 years, and said in sentencing that he believed there had been a sexual element to the killing. What the jury never heard. After the verdict, reporting restrictions were lifted, and the public learned something the jury had been shielded from. Material recovered from Tabak's computers that the judge had ruled inadmissible during the trial. This causes public fury every time it happens, and it's worth understanding why the rule exists. English courts are extremely cautious about what's called bad character or propensity evidence, because of a well-documented failure mode in human reasoning. Once a jury learns that a defendant is the kind of person who might do a thing, it becomes very difficult for them to assess whether he actually did this thing on this night. With this state of mind, the evidence stops being probative and starts being prejudicial. Juries convict the character rather than the act, which is, of course, precisely what the newspapers had done to Christopher Jefferies 4 months earlier, with a man who had done nothing at all. The same cognitive shortcut, running in 2 directions in the same case. In the courtroom, the law built a wall against it. Outside the courtroom, there was no wall, and a retired teacher's life was taken apart because his manner and his hair fit a template. The long tail. In November 2011, and again the following March, Christopher Jefferies gave evidence to the Leveson inquiry into press standards. He described a frenzied campaign to blacken his character, built from smear, innuendo, and fiction, and said the press had shamelessly vilified him. He described the period after his release, advised by friends and lawyers not to leave the house, as a form of house arrest. He noted that articles had speculated about his sexuality as a supposed motive. In 2013, the chief constable of Avon in Somerset, Nick Gargan, sent him a letter that stated unequivocally that he had played no part in the murder and was wholly innocent and apologized for his suffering. Gargan accepted the force should have made his elimination public at the time, while maintaining that the arrest had been a legitimate step in a complex inquiry. The BBC noted at the time how unusual such a letter was. Jefferies himself has never really put it down. He became a campaigner for press accountability, gave his name and his story to that argument, and was still making the case publicly as recently as 2025, noting that the second stage of the Leveson inquiry, the part meant to examine relationships between the press and the police, was shelved and has not been revived by any government since, which leaves the central question of this case genuinely unresolved: why it matters. The murder of Joanna Yates was, in investigative terms, solved competently and reasonably fast. 34 days from her disappearance to a charge over a Christmas period in snow, with a delayed post-mortem. Detectives noticed that a helpful witness was a little too interested. They asked for a swab. The science did the rest. That's the boring version, and the boring version is the accurate one. The reason the case still gets made into documentaries is the other thing that happened, and the honest lesson there is not the tabloids were wicked. It's narrower and more useful than that. A false story was assembled in about 72 hours out of 3 separate ingredients, none of which was a lie about the crime itself. Ingredient 1, a killer who correctly calculated that pointing at someone else would buy him time. Ingredient 2, an information vacuum in which an inquiry released details slowly and a leak, alleged, denied, never resolved, put a name into circulation before anyone had established anything. Ingredient 3, a commercial machine that could turn eccentricity into a character sketch faster than any process could correct it. Remove any one of those, and the story doesn't hold. That's the part worth remembering, because those 3 conditions have not gone away. They have migrated. Today, the vacuum gets filled in hours rather than days by people with no publisher to find and no address for a libel writ to arrive at. The Contempt of Court Act still applies from the moment of arrest, but it was written for an era with a manageable number of publishers, and underneath all of it sits the thing that actually did the damage, a very old and very human habit of reading strangeness as guilt. Christopher Jefferies had unusual hair, a precise way of speaking, and a habit of correcting people. Vincent Tabak had a doctorate, a girlfriend, a professional job, and the good sense to look concerned. One of them lost several years of his life to public suspicion. The other one was helping with inquiries. If a person is arrested but never charged, should the law require police to publicly confirm their elimination, or would that create its own problems? And in an era where the story gets written by millions of anonymous accounts rather than a handful of newspapers, is there any realistic way to protect someone like Christopher Jefferies today? Let us know what you think. Cases like this remind us that some questions continue long after the headlines fade. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing for more carefully researched true crime stories. We'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next documentary.